Okay, let's kick off this evening's event. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Taylor, and it's a great honor to be the Dean of the John M. Olin School of Business at Washington University in St. Louis. Today, we are proud to host a WashU at Brookings event that will take a deep dive into the subject of diversity, equality, and inclusion, particularly as it pertains to our everyday lives. Our two expert guests will be tackling the timely topic from Ferguson to Minneapolis. Where do we go from here? These are difficult but necessary conversations, underscored by the all too often tragic events like the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and now the recent shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. We must all stay actively engaged in these discussions to make progress on the challenges we face concerning race, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Together we can help bring about this important change. Before we begin, let me briefly explain our format for today. First, I'm going to introduce our distinguished host, Adrienne Davis, who will provide a few remarks, introduce our guests, and then begin and facilitate the conversation. And there will later be an opportunity for questions and answers. I'll leave it to Professor Davis to provide fuller introductions to Andre Perry and Senator Williams. But I just want to say what an honor it is to have three such distinguished speakers with us today. In particular, I want to mention Dre Perry's outstanding book, I have a copy here, Know Your Price, which, as a business school dean, I can only describe as a remarkable and astute exercise in asset valuation, a new means of determining the value of Black communities, demonstrating the worth of Black people's intrinsic personal strengths, real property, traditional institutions. And it's written with a great originality, with convincing insight, and I do strongly recommend it. It begins and ends with the statement that knowing your price means understanding the value of family. And that can be a civic family just as much as a genetic family. At the end of today's session, we'll give details of how you can get a copy of this great book. Senator Brian Williams is a member of the Missouri Senate from the 14th District in St. Louis County, and the first African-American male elected to the Missouri Senate in 2 decades. And I'm proud and honored to call Brian my friend. As a WashU Dean, I'm also proud to say that Senator Williams is a WashU alum with not one, but 2 master's degrees from here, one in public administration and the other in legal studies. Finally, let me also say how proud I am to have my friend and colleague, Adrienne Davis, here to host this important discussion. Adrienne is Vice Provost and the William N. Van Cleve Professor of Law here at WashU. As Vice Provost, Adrienne focuses on faculty affairs, including advancing scholarly and career development, developing supporting policies, and enhancing faculty diversity. And as a teacher, as well as a scholar, Adrienne is a feminist and a critical race theorist who focuses on, if you like, the law of daily life, on how law regulates and affects people's daily interactions, decisions, and identities. From 2015 to 2017, she also chaired the university's Commission on Diversity and Inclusion, which was charged with designing a university-wide plan for diversity. And just last year, in 2019, Adrienne was named the founding director of the university's Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. And that center engages faculty and students across WashU's 7 schools to study how race and ethnicity are integral to the most complex and challenging issues of our time. She also founded and is co-director of the Law, Identity, and Culture Initiative. Okay, so that's enough for me. Without further ado, I now hand the floor to Professor Adrienne Davis.
Good evening, and thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. I'm very excited about this conversation with the senator and with Andre Perry. I think it's apparent that the nation is at a crossroads regarding racial justice, and especially regarding state-sanctioned violence against Black people. And I want to ask what it would look like if we collectively put the same energy into ending structural racism that we put into curing cancer. What if our generation saw our generation's moonshot, as ending white supremacy? From the university perspective, I want to ask what it would look like if our undergraduates came here to learn about, to major and to minor in anti-racism in the same numbers they came to major in pre-med. And speaking from my adopted home, St. Louis, which my colleague and friend Walter Johnson has called the broken heart of America, what if we dedicated ourselves to making our home, St. Louis, not a name on a list of racial violence and inequity, but instead a leader for the nation in finding models for police accountability and equitable policing? What if we became a model of a future for urban equity and democracy? So again, we have here today two of the most respected, I think, thought leaders in the country on this. We have he's not really my representative, but he is the representative for the district in which Washington University sits. So we have State Senator Brian Williams, who really, I think, has emerged as one of the great policy influencers and thought leaders of our time, and whose devotion to moving our state forward to a fully equitable and fully democratic future is something that I admire every single day. And we have Andre Perry, who is one of the most respected scholars, researchers, and policy influencers doing tremendous work at Brookings. So welcome to you both.
Hey, thanks for having us.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Adrienne. That was a tremendous introduction. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I want to start with, the title here, which is from Ferguson to Minneapolis, where do we go from here? So I want to invite you both to tell us a little bit about what it means to say we're here. What is here? Where are we? How did we get here? And maybe share some of your own thoughts about how you each individually got here.
I'll start. And again, I want to thank everyone at the business school for having me, for hosting me. It's a tremendous honor. And I know that we are in perilous times, so I hope I can offer some advice and some knowledge that will help, and I hope to learn as well. I grew up in a Black majority neighborhood, in a Black majority municipality. And so when I heard from Ferguson to Minneapolis, I thought about growing up in that Black place, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. It's a small Black majority municipality surrounded by Pittsburgh on three sides. And I remember the number of incidents of run-ins with the police that growing up, you become numb to it. You think it is normal. It is something that I normalized even into my adulthood. I believe it or not, I had long locks, dreadlocks rolling down my back. I could sit on them. And in New Orleans, where I lived for 14 years, wearing locks was a sign for some as being a thug. And I can't tell you how many times I've been pulled over with my wife, my child, the embarrassment, the hurt, the fear. A lot of times we talk about the conversations we have with our sons, and I certainly appreciate that. But for me, there is no one conversation. This is an ongoing conversation that I have with my child, with myself. This is not about fearing for other people. I certainly do, but I fear for my own life. And so this conversation for me, I'm sure will bring in data, will bring in policy, but in both of those areas, this is very personal, that I am tired. I want change. I will demand change. I want to be bold. I want to look at my own institution as well as others to demand change. And so I just want to take this opportunity to, again, to thank everyone, because this is the kind of conversation that we need every day in many different settings. So thanks for having this, hosting this conversation.
Thank you. Senator?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I second what Andre said. I'm grateful to the Olin Business School, as well as leaders from Washington University School of Law, of course, the Brookings Institute, as well as its executive education program, and of course, Washington University, for being not only great partners with me, but taking the time to engage and actually talk about really important and pressing issues. What we have to understand is that Black people face a lot of the same challenges no matter where they are. And it's my job to bring that perspective to those who don't have it. I must use my experiences and insight to help people see these issues from what I believe a fresh perspective. As a state senator, I'm also able to look at it from a position of what laws can be changed to make this situation better. Not just in Missouri, but how do we use Missouri as a way to set precedent for the rest of the country and not be known for having some of the most draconian policies ever heard to man. When I think about the community I come from, very similar to Andre's community, I grew up in Ferguson, Missouri, single mom. My mom and I are 19 years apart. First in my family to go to college. And that experience alone made me almost too familiar with being afraid of law enforcement, doing everything I could in my power to stay out of the way. Of course, I've had my fair share of experiences of driving while Black, being pulled over with 3 of my friends who were all college students, and we were home for Christmas break, and being handcuffed on the sidewalk in freezing temperatures. To think that we felt as if law enforcement did us a favor by letting us go, when our reality, we didn't do anything wrong. Our rights were violated, and that has become a normal in the Black community. When I think about police reform and some of these different things that we're fighting for in justice for people of color, this is something that has become a 400-year-long epidemic. It has plagued our communities, it has plagued our families, it has put us in a position of such an unprecedented level of disarray. And right now we have to have a conversation. And it's not just a conversation among people of color, it's a conversation among everyone to come together and stand against not only hate, but also figure out how do we make our country and our communities a safe place for everyone.
I want to follow up real quick. Thank you both for sharing those really poignant but invaluable for us to know experiences. I want to go back to 1955 when Emmett Till was tortured and murdered in Mississippi. 14-year-old young Black boy from Chicago whose mother had, like many Black children, sent him down south for the summer to stay with relatives. And some of the white supremacists in Mississippi decided he wasn't following the rules and brutally tortured him and left his body at the bottom of a canal. You know, when they took him out of the canal, the state actors in Mississippi said, well, we're just going to put this mangled body in a pine box and we're just going to bury him down here along with all of our supremacist actions and our degradation and everything else. But his mother, Mamie very infamously said, no, you're sending my boy home. He's coming back home to Chicago. And then she insisted on having an open casket funeral, hoping that seeing what white supremacy, what racial supremacy had done to her son, hoping that the nation and the world, if they saw that, you know, people would put a stop to it. And it didn't. Mm-hmm. It didn't. So here we are 65 years later in the middle of what I'm calling this long summer of Black death. What's different now? It certainly feels different. It feels to me like we may finally be at the moment that Mamie Till was hoping we were at. But what feels different to both of you about why now. You know, Senator, you were saying that people now seem to collectively want to do something, right? And you know, Andre, I think your book is all about this. What's different now that makes us believe things can be different?
Well, I'll go. One, there's a difference in impact of the different sort of incidents that sparked a movement. We saw the aftermath of Emmett Till. We actually saw George Floyd get murdered. You know, and one, I say this all the time, while I value technology and its ability to help us expose some of these racist acts that we know have occurred, it is not good to see murder every day. And we certainly had the young man, Blake in Wisconsin, shot. I hear he is paralyzed. And we see this constantly. Now, the difference between now and then is that we've seen Black people rally and move legislation based upon prior incidents. What is new for me is to see so many others rallying behind these horrific acts to demand change. So for me, I do have more hope than I've ever had before. I was born in 1970, right after many of the historic civil rights legislation was passed. And I do think I grew up with a sense of hope and optimism because of that. But it clearly went away in the 80s, 90s, as you saw wealth disparities grow. But for me, this moment is different in that I see young people, people of different races, people from around the world demanding change. Now, there's no guarantee. We must keep the protests up. The legislation of the past that that did not deliver everything we wanted did not occur, although those things did not occur without protests leading up to it. So I actually welcome the activity in the streets because it gives policymakers and people like me the ammunition to move forward, to keep pushing. So I'm hopeful because of the wide variety of people who are now demanding change. And so I'm encouraged by this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's extremely important to recognize the nexus between Emmett Till and some of the horrific murders that we've seen today. Clearly, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless other people who have lost their life to police brutality should still be here today. And they are our modern day Emmett Till. Racism is no different than COVID-19. It's a virus and it has yet to eradicate itself from the earth. And it has created a domino effect where we are starting to see firsthand how this is impacting not only the quality of life of people of color, but it has spilled over and has almost questioned whether or not we view each other from a place of humanity. When I saw George Floyd with on the ground with a police officer's knee on his neck for almost 9 minutes, and I can tell you even the video involving Jacob, when I tell you it's unbelievable to see that with your own eyes, or even to come here locally and think about the young kids that went to WashU University that were racially profiled, just walking home after they paid their tab from IHOP, just a few blocks from Washington University campus, or to think about the fact that we have circumstances where we see folks lose their life and folks are holding assault rifles at peaceful protesters. It's by far probably nothing short of a horrible Quentin Tarantino film. I mean, it's almost like a movie to when you watch these things and you say, wow, these things are happening. And for me as a state senator, they say, what is your biggest issue with this fight? My biggest issue with this fight is not only that it's personal, but if I was to take off this lapel pin, I would be no different than George Floyd. I would be no different than Michael Brown. I would be no different than Breonna Taylor. And I think we have to understand that certain positions and certain levels of privilege, whether you're white, whether you're of some other ethnicity, does not make you exempt from the challenging trials and tribulations that have impacted humanity. And I hope that we're moving in a direction where folks are going to start calling out hate and stop turning their head to conversations that they know are not appropriate, actions that they know are not correct. This subculture within the police department that has tends to contaminate what used to be a noble job, and get back on the track of not only where police officers, but our leaders in various positions, including mine, are upholding that oath of honor, and that is to protect and serve the public.
You know, can I just quickly jump on that? You know, who is the public that police are protecting and serving? And it is clear it is a white public and not a black one. You know, this is bigger than police. Certainly police deserve a great amount of scrutiny. This is bigger than what's going on in police. And I'll turn to business. There's nothing that says a black person doesn't belong in an economy than a police officer snuffing him out in broad daylight. That is a value statement about who belongs and who does not. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation in the business school, because too often we separate economic issues from social issues. No, they are absolutely linked. The same values, the same perception of Black life that Derek Chauvin, the officer that killed George Floyd, those attitudes are shared by housing appraisers, by CEOs, by managers in other areas of our life. So while we like to talk and isolate this issue as one of policing, this is an issue that permeates all of society. It just manifests itself differently when you're talking about policing than you're talking about corporate America. But there is a snuffing out of Black people in corporate America that just looks a little different. It looks like people not getting promoted. It looks like lower pay. It looks like not getting a call back when you apply for the job. And all of these things contribute to the overall resources in a community that renders majority Black communities with less power to defend themselves, to defend ourselves. So for me, this is a conversation about policing, but we also have to connect it to other arenas, particularly when we're talking in a business school. Let's talk about what we need to defund in businesses in order to have equitable society. What do we need to defund in colleges and universities and think tanks to have a better society? This is bigger than policing.
Can I invite you to maybe share a little bit about your really terrific new book? It's in the other room. I'm gonna hold it up. I left it in the other room. Do you have a copy? Can you hold it up?
Oh, very good.
Know Your Price: Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the solutions or some of the policies that you advocate for in the book, especially the way that you're connecting up all of these different domains? We can't separate policing from housing, from economic inclusion. There we go.
Yeah, do you mind if I'm just going to share a slide, or a few slides, just to give you the research anchor for the book. what you're seeing right here is a chart looking at the neighborhood median home values by Black population. So on the x-axis, you see the percent of Black people in neighborhoods. And on the y-axis is the price of homes. And as you can see, as the percent of, or the share of Black people increases in the neighborhood, the price, the listing price of the home drops. It's very linear, and we can see homes in areas where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. They're about on average $340,000. In areas where the Black population is greater than 50%, it's about half as much. But people will always point to education, crime, crime, and other observable factors as to why those home prices are lower. But those are things we can control for. And so that's what I did. I looked at that absolute price difference, but we controlled for structural characteristics. So we looked at similar homes of similar sizes, same number of rooms. We looked at quality per square foot using the Zillow data, but then we controlled for neighborhood characteristics. We control for education. We control for crime. We control for walkability and all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found astounds, that homes in Black neighborhoods are undervalued by $48,000, about 23%. Accumulatively, that's $156 billion. And that's occurring all over the country. Wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where housing devaluation is occurring. In St. Louis is about 28%, about 30,000 per home. I'll just give you an idea. In Lynchburg, 81% difference. There are places where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher. Nashville, for instance, plus 10%, Boston plus 23%. And no, Boston is not less racist than Lynchburg, but the home prices are different. Now, I just want to put this in perspective, that 156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount that Blacks use to start up businesses. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees, replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. It's would have covered almost all of Hurricane Katrina damage. And by the way, the 15th anniversary is this Friday, I believe. And it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis, which leads me to this claim. There's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. I say that is because oftentimes what you hear in incidents, what did this person do to warrant his own death? We ask that constantly. And just like the housing issue, there are policies and practices that throttle Black success, economic mobility, wealth. These things must be dismantled. Literally, over-policing literally arrests economic mobility. So I just brought up those slides because it's the anchor of my book. I talk in very personal terms of how this plays out. My father was murdered in prison. When I visited where he lived in areas with significant housing devaluation. He did not have the opportunity to grow because he lived in areas with under-financed schools, under-resourced schools, lack of infrastructure. Instead of going to a drug rehab facility, he ended up in prison and he ended up dead. So there are real consequences to the disenfranchisement of Black people that often is reflected in police violence towards those residents.
Yeah, also to kind of add on to what Andre just made a really good point, housing. Now, everyone knows historically housing is the keystone to any generational wealth, especially in Black families, is their home. When folks ask the magic question, how far is Ferguson from here? Or what is Ferguson like? To think that Ferguson is less than 10 miles, less than 5 miles probably, from Washington University's campus. To think that we have what's called the Del Mar Divide. And if you were to go north of a boulevard, the home value, the quality of services decline tremendously. And that goes back to what Andre was saying, is that if we start creating an equitable environment where we invest in all communities, where we level the playing field and make sure that everyone has a fair opportunity to receive an education. We have an educated workforce, a fair tax code that levels that playing field, affordable healthcare, and ultimately safe communities. We could truly tackle some of the systemic challenges rooted around racism and ultimately be able to enhance the quality of life for all Americans, including and especially people of color.
If each of you could wave the proverbial magic wand and have one or two policies, just one or two policies or initiatives, tomorrow would stand up. You wouldn't have to fuss with anybody. You wouldn't have to fight with anybody. You wouldn't have to negotiate, just one or two things. What would those be? And Andre, I really invite you to kind of take the national approach, but Brian, Senator, as you said, Missouri is my adopted home. And I don't like the fact that I feel like we're about to become the new Mississippi, and not in the good ways of Mississippi, not like the food and the culture.
Not the food, yeah.
Yeah, not the food and the literature, but the things that were not good about Mississippi in the past. And I really appreciate all the things that you've done. So if you can help us think about, our regional focus and emphasis and what we can do, begin to, again, sort of model what an equitable democratic urban future can look like.
Absolutely.
Andre,
you go first.
Yeah, I'll stay in the area of housing. In areas where there's significant housing devaluation, there's often a stockpile of homes that are priced under $100,000 that banks won't back in terms of a mortgage. You essentially have to pay for. We need to develop new loan products, new mortgage products that enable low-income renters to become homeowners. In addition, we do need microloans to current homeowners. When you have devaluation, you essentially have less discretionary money to put towards home improvements, to send your kid to college, all those different things. But we should give homeowners in devalued areas some type of microloan to make up for the loss of revenue. Now, I also recommend, and I'll put in the chat my paper on reparations, but we also need to include a way for Black people to gain wealth that is separate from housing. Then, Black people learn the hard way. If there's a recession or economic crisis that disproportionately impacts housing, you wipe out most of Black wealth. And that's what happened in 2008, 2009. And so we need alternatives for wealth building. And I really like the baby bonds idea stewarded by Derek Hamilton at the New School. But there are many different things. I'll just stay with those three. But we do need policy change around housing and wealth building that, quite frankly, white people were afforded during the Depression and in other significant periods of our time, to the exclusion of Black folk.
And I'll just add to that and reinforce that, because I think people, when we're talking about Black people and what I call Black economic personality, sort of Black capacity to not just earn income, but to actually hold and generate wealth, I think people immediately start thinking about, we're asking for a handout, right? And they forget the fact that, the early United States colonized the entire western half of the western 2/3 of the country, right? Took it away from many Native American tribes, but essentially gave it away to a lot of white pioneers. And, you know, many of those territories had rules that precluded or restricted the ability of Black folks to also be pioneers and go out and do that sort of massive, I think, redistribution of wealth. And the same thing, as many people have noted, with the GI Bill, right? And the GI Bill following World War II, when the soldiers came home, and we decided as a nation to collectively invest in them through their education and also through the homeowners programs, you know, the lending programs. Even if Black soldiers qualified, because of racial segregation, they weren't able to go and take that money and go to the same schools that had the same value or the same neighborhoods. So I think it's important that we all remember that the nation is constantly generating and distributing wealth, right, to all kinds of folks.
And yet, and before the senator speaks, and yet we constantly we say what's wrong with Black people as to why we don't have wealth. You know, we don't have wealth because of financial literacy. I apologize to all the folks who have their financial literacy programs. I want to be clear. The wealth divide wasn't created because white people had that much more financial knowledge. It came about because of the policies you mentioned, and it excluded Black folk from them. Or we could not utilize them in the same way. So we need
or the wealth was taken from us.
And the wealth was taken from us.
A lot of Black Southern land was just taken.
That's right. That's exactly right. So we should end this white supremacist myth that the conditions of Black neighborhoods and cities are a direct result of the people in them. No, policy created them. That's why I say that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve.
Yeah, absolutely. And to tie into what you both were saying with housing, we need to also view public education as such. We need to invest in our public education system, and our education system should not reflect the not only systemic failures, but the perception of people of color. So if I can wave a magical wand, it would be two things. One, we would fully invest into our public education system to ensure that everyone had a fair opportunity to get a quality education. Secondly, we would invest in not only good education, but alternative education, meaning everyone's not intended and does not have to go to college. So we need to have trade opportunities and for folks to be able to go in directly into the workforce and make a livable wage. In the world of COVID-19, the federal government just doled out trillions of dollars. It's no reason why we should not be figuring out in the world of automation, how do we create an opportunity to advance, inform and educate and transition our workforce into the new normal of virtual and technology resources, and not have to forfeit making a quality wage in the process. So folks should be able to train, they should be able to get an education, they should be able to go into a new lane within the workforce and not have to worry about losing any facet of their quality of life in the process. And those are two things I think go hand in hand, is that a lot of folks don't go back to school because they can't afford it. Or a lot of folks are going to be figuring out what they're going to do next professionally, and they're going to have to pick between quitting their job and picking up a new trade, or staying where they at and praying that they can keep their job long enough to survive. And we have to be really serious about this.
So far, you've both been really ambitious, but neither of you has mentioned the R word, reparations, explicitly.
I think that reparations is something we should pursue, not because of the wealth it could potentially create, but because it's the morally the right thing to do. We're owed that money. So I write about reparations quite a bit, and a lot of folks want me to talk about it in terms of its importance in closing the wealth gap. I don't care if it closed the wealth gap or not. We're owed that money, and so if anyone did labor and did not get paid, I would say pay the person. And we also need to restore the value that's been extracted by racism through housing and discrimination, through a biased criminal justice system, through Jim Crow segregation, and a lot of this bad systems that that extract wealth from Black folk. So we're owed. This is not a matter of should we do this for the future of the country and this and that. That it may help, but we're just owed that money. Cut the check, pay us. So so I that's my perspective. I think it is needed. And I'll put it in the chat. Several other populations have received reparations. Japanese for internment. American Native American brothers and sisters receive some form of reparation. I don't think it's enough. Even 9/11 victims receive a form of reparations. The only group that has not received reparations is Black people, and that has to change.
Yeah, and we also have to think about the fact, and it was one thing that can happen in the form of an reparation-like intention, but I still wouldn't quite say reparation, is that we do today need universal health care. Everyone should have access to quality health care. I noticed in the chat the conversation around mental health disparity. Right here in St. Louis, I serve on the board for a community health center called People's Health Center. And I was able to work to get its first behavior health center in the city of St. Louis for children in underserved communities. We truly overlook the importance of having access to everything, let alone healthcare. And that's one thing I think serves with education. They're mutually exclusive, not one or the other. Together, education and access to quality healthcare, and ultimately access to economic resources is what's going to ultimately uplift a race of people.
And Adrienne, can I offer just one more set of solutions? And I'm actually going to share my screen again to do so. Let's see here. I just want to lay out some stats, and folks in the business school generally know this, but I'm just going to repeat them just in case you forgot. Black people represent 12% of the population, but only 2% of the nation's businesses. Only 1% of Black business owners obtain a loan in their founding year, compared to 7% of white entrepreneurs. Now, you remember, most people start a business using the equity in their home, and that devaluation that I talked about really throttles our ability to start a business. Black entrepreneurs are denied loans more than twice as often as their white peers. People of color pay higher interest rates. About half, this is an important thing, about half of Black businesses survive compared to 60, after the Great Recession, compared to 60% of white-owned firms. And we know that the PPP loan fiasco really set Black businesses back. So I throw out those stats to say, we need to beef up investments towards Black businesses in Black neighborhoods. If you are a Black business, you're in a commercial corridor in a Black majority place, we should figure out ways to get you the kind of capital so that you can hire an employee, so you can weather the storm, so you can start a business. But clearly we need some type of investment strategy to uplift Black businesses, because what we're seeing now only accentuates the wealth gaps and the lack of protection in Black communities.
Absolutely.
I'd like to, so everything you both lay out is incredibly compelling, right? Who could oppose creating more wealth and educating children, right? So where are the obstacles?
Oh. Racist white people.
Why don't we do this tomorrow?
I don't know if, like, let's be clear. When senator goes to the legislature and there are bills presented, I guarantee that promote racial equity, I guarantee you those are the folks that are blocking progress. And so we just need to be upfront about that. there are lots of people in this country who have no interest in changing the power dynamics in it. And so we're witnessing it right now in the presidential debates, or the debates around who should be president. There is a large segment of the population that has no interest in valuing Black people, investing in Black people, and trying to create the democracy that the language of our Constitution says we have.
Absolutely. And I think what we have to understand also, I'm going to take it back here local to Missouri. Right now, we're in the middle of a special session. And this special session is addressing what the governor likes to call violent crime, which is clearly targeting violent crime issues in his mind in the urban core, St. Louis and Kansas City, Missouri. That he proposed a bill that would send roughly 12-year-olds, and they were nice enough to raise the age to 14, basically to be charged as adults for being convicted of a crime that may involve a firearm, armed criminal action, unlawful possession, which we all know you can have anything illegal sitting next to you and be charged with unlawful possession. And Adrienne, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But when you think about who and what and where that particular legislation and policies target, it's folks that look just like Andre and I. They're young Black boys, they're young Black women, and they're targeting communities that, based upon systemic failure and intention, have failed and never had a chance of survival from the start.
You know, and we're folks are quick to say, what's going on in the Black community? Why aren't you concerned with Black on Black crime? You hear that constantly, you know, and we can talk about what Black on Black crime is, that most crime is interpersonal. We know that. So there's white on white crime. There's Hispanic on Hispanic crime, all that. So we should eradicate that term. But the real point is, folks refuse to see the connection between policy violence and physical violence and how it plays out in the street. You deprive communities of proper housing, proper education, proper opportunities, you're going to get that. You know, and I'm the first person, I think I'm one of these upright Negroes you read about. I want to see boys and girls dress properly and all that jazz. I'm one of those guys. But the reality is, if you have policies that devalue Black life, you're going to get violence, because violence begets violence. And so let's not ever discount the policymakers who will treat a child like an adult. That has robbed, those kind of policies have robbed thousands upon millions of Black Americans from having an opportunity to self-actualize. The three strikes laws of the 80s and 90s arrested economic mobility in many communities. So I mean, this ahistoric, short-sighted, myopic sort of view of the world, but just look what's happening in the streets, and disconnect it from what's happening in the overall policy of violence, is also a form of violence, because you're abdicating your responsibility for addressing the root cause of these problems, which is policy.
I asked the governor in the conversation, and we're not going to get overly political in terms of, you know, parties and all of that. We're strictly talking about behavior and perspectives around these issues. Two, one, when you think about gun violence in the Black community, if you can find a gun manufacturer in the hood, I would love to meet them. That's not where the guns are coming from.
That's right.
In Missouri, they passed the law to do away with laws that would allow you to have a license to carry a firearm. Since then, gun violence has increased almost 30%. So right there, when I talk about why we need to keep guns off college campuses, why we need to fight against not allowing guns on public transportation, why do we need to have some mechanism for training when it comes to carrying a firearm in the state of Missouri, and why do we need to have access to assault weapons like AR-15s and AK-47s? And the first thing that they say to me is, well, we don't want to violate the constitutional right of a Missourian to carry. And they don't see that nexus between the more people that carry, the more likely we're going to have an outcome of gun violence. And to think that these guns are popping up in these communities, and these communities are not manufacturing these guns, they are coming from somewhere. To think right here in Missouri, gun sales went through the roof during the pandemic. Through the roof. I mean, you can't even buy a gun right now because they're all sold out. Or to think that we live in a state where I fight and advocate for police reform. The governor says, well, Brian, would you be able to support a witness protection program? Absolutely. If witnesses actually were protected, because I can tell you right now, if a bad actor commits a crime in the community and you have someone who has a bench warrant or someone who's afraid of the police, they're not going to come forward and talk to law enforcement about anything. So what is the point of a witness protection program if the witnesses don't feel safe with law enforcement? There's no real relationship there. So we need to figure out, how do we build and create this relationship? How do we get guns off the street? How do we make our streets safer by understanding that the Constitution is not mutually exclusive to common sense? And common sense is having gun reforms in the state of Missouri to where folks are safe. And then most importantly, we are dealing with gun violence and crime from a rehabilitative standpoint. Why are we pushing young people into education opportunities? Why are we putting them into trade schools? Why are we not ensuring that they have access to mental health services? How come we're not providing those services for law enforcement? How come we're not addressing issues around trauma? How come we're not, how come we're allowing municipalities to use folks as personal ATMs and charging them excessive fines for driving with expired license plates when we know that they're barely making enough money to make ends meet and they need that car to get to work? Why are we criminalizing people for being poor? That's what our conversation needs to be about. Our conversation does not need to be about how do we lock more people up and how do we make people feel bad for being poor or being Black.
Let me ask you this. We've got a lot of questions here, so I'm gonna start to pull some of these questions out. So can I ask a provocative question?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So Alicia Barnes asks us, referring back to past scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois, you both are calling for some economic development and investment as a piece of this. I think you more so, Andre, maybe than the senator, but you're both calling for this. So Alicia asks, can we achieve racial equality in a capitalist system when racism was the original product of the capitalist founding of America?
Racialized capitalism is real. I do believe that you don't need the drag of racism in an economic model. And what the questioner is absolutely right on. Racism has been the growth model for many industries and for the country as a whole. We built the infrastructure of this country on slavery. We continue to exploit labor among people of color and women. And so, but I have to believe that we can actually remove that drag of racism and sexism. It does not have to be part of the model. So that's what I'm achieving. But I'm not, I'm clear about, that I'm not one of these folks sort of like in the Jay-Z way that feels that you can wealth your way to equality. That's not going to happen. You know, the line of what's better than one billionaire two. I don't know. I think that's a sign of market failure in a lot of different ways. But the point of the matter is, wealth is more about protection. It's more about value, and it's more about whether or not you're achieving a sense of the American dream. But in this country, it has also been a sign of discrimination and oppression. And so if we can get rid of that, the oppressive nature of capitalism, I think we will be better off. But I hear the person who asked that question, I hear the concern because it's real.
Yeah, and I share that same sentiment. I hear the concern, and it's really difficult to wrap your head around it in a racialized society, to really be able to do that. And I think Andre made a really good point. I mean, we have to look at how do we tackle capitalism, and we all know that is if COVID-19 hasn't exposed our country of its failures and what it values, I don't know what else to put in front of us. And right now, to think, even in the state of Missouri, there's a political, or the country, a political debate about wearing masks lets you know what the state and the nature of this country is. And I don't think losing lives, let alone Black lives, is a priority when it comes to how much revenue this country generates and the people that are in the positions of power wanting to maintain that. And if that wasn't true, I can tell you right now, some of the rhetoric that's coming from the highest level of leadership known to man in this country would not be happening. So I hope that we can work through this. But right now, I think that our country has become more focused on capital more now than it has ever been. And it really has put me in a concerning state.
Senator, I have a follow-up question for you from Kurt Greenbaum. He said, Senator, you operate in an overwhelmingly Republican institution. What reception do you receive when you raise these issues with your colleagues, and what gives you hope right now in Missouri?
Well, one, I meet everyone where they are. And I think as an elected leader in this state, I have a priority, and that's to humanize all of the experiences of everyone I represent, especially Black people. So I work very hard to build relationships and create some type of connection around the challenges that we face in the communities that I represent. I think also it's important to understand the rules and the procedures of what you do. So clearly understanding those rules and procedures of the Senate, just as quick as one of my colleagues may want to tell me no, I understand procedural things to interfere with things that are important to them. So we have figured out how to kind of coexist a little bit. And right now that coexistence is steered around some of the reforms that I'm focused on now that we would talk about a little later, which is Senate Bill 16, police reform bill that I filed, and a couple other things in the criminal justice reform space.
That's a great follow on to this question. Our friend Stan has been really active in the chat. Thanks for engaging with us, Stan.
I know Stan.
So Stan asks a question, and I think this may be in your bill, Brian. He asked whether we should be looking to repeal or abolish police qualified immunity. And maybe you can just tell people, what that is, give them a little bit of context for that, and then talk about what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely. And this is my opportunity to step in Andre's wheelhouse a little bit and put my professor hat on. I know, Adrienne, you have an appreciation for this as well as Dean Taylor and everyone else that's in the space of academia. So what we have here is my comprehensive policing reform plan. Clearly, there was a couple things that I want to just touch on that's really important. One, this bill would eliminate no-knock warrants. It would also prohibit the use of chokeholds in Missouri. It would also address circumstances in terms of sexual conduct between law enforcement and an inmate or offender while in custody. So it bans sexual conduct. And then it also does something else. And I'm bouncing around a little bit because I just want to touch on the really big ones. Establish a uniform definition of law enforcement officer to distinguish them from security personnel. So let me just kind of talk about really quick what these things mean, not only in layman's terms, but situations and precedent that justify why we need to put these reforms in place. Right here in St. Louis County, where I live and represent, we had a woman whose dog was killed due to a no-knock warrant, which led to her filing a lawsuit and suing the government over an unpaid utility bill. So they kicked in her door, killed her dog for an unpaid utility bill. For those that are non-believers, you can look this up. This is a public record, and this is also something that's been documented right here in St. Louis. Clearly prohibit the use of chokeholds. Law enforcement and I have had several conversations about this, and they say, well, Senator, we don't use the chokehold, nor do we train any of our officers. I said, well, that's great. Then we can ban it and make sure there's accountability measures in place if somebody chooses to use an MMA move or some move they saw on TV from Conor McGregor, then we're going to make sure that they held accountable for this since you guys don't train on it. Another one that's really important is creating that uniform definition of law enforcement. The reason this is important, let's go back to Florida with Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. If we require all security personnel or anyone that is acting in the role of law enforcement to have uniform training to be able to uphold a lot of these reforms and training that law enforcement is trained on, then it would prevent an unqualified and untrained security officer from engaging in a situation that may end up in the loss of someone or someone of color, as we saw in Florida with Trayvon Martin. What this also would do is allow us to empower law enforcement. So if you don't have any proper training or uniform training as in law enforcement, then you need to call the police. Also, we have another one, which I think is really important, is prohibit law enforcement agencies from receiving military surplus equipment. I can't think of any reason why we need to see tanks and all this military grade equipment just going through our communities. So we need to prohibit that and getting funding for that, because right now the federal government will give a law enforcement agency in Missouri a tank for free. They don't even have to pay for this stuff. Also, there's one more I think is really important, and we were talking about this, is that eliminating citizens' arrest, which would require individuals to justify the use of physical force in self-defense or defense of property, as well as prove why it was necessary to detain an aggressor until law enforcement arrives at the scene. For those that are familiar with Missouri or national news, you would have heard about the McCloskey situation right here in St. Louis, which was a couple that actually spoke at the Republican National Convention yesterday. And they were talking about how they pulled an assault rifle and a firearm on a handgun on peaceful protesters. And there's an argument that it's legal in Missouri and they have the right to do that if someone's on their property, and that property is even considered a public street or easement. So what this does is eliminate citizen arrests from folks being aggressors, but also what happened to Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, where someone doesn't perceive or may have even thought that someone committed a crime a week ago. They're driving down the street and they take it into their own hands to detain someone, which led to Ahmaud Arbery being killed by citizens who really should have notified law enforcement. So by doing this, it puts more responsibility on an accountable law enforcement agency, and it's allowing citizens to go back into a space of actually utilizing law enforcement with hope that they have proper training and de-escalation training to handle various situations, whether it's someone with mental health issues or someone that's maybe in a situation where they may have heightened emotions. So these are just a couple of things from my comprehensive policing reform plan. We have been working very diligently with activists, the ACLU. We've talked with members of law enforcement, and we've made it very clear that this isn't an us versus them situation. This is us coming together and understanding that we need to not only hold our police officers accountable, but eliminate this subculture of bad policing that has tainted the image of what should be a noble job of holding the oath of protecting and serving the public.
Yeah, Senator, and I want to invite you into this also, Andre. If my students at your alma mater had their way, we would radically reconfigure law enforcement altogether, right? We would radically rethink the extent to which we need armed personnel intervening in some kinds of conflicts or issues, or we might include more social services trained people as part of what we think of as law enforcement. Would you expand the bill to include that as well, or do you think that what you're doing is a good start and we can tackle the rest of it later?
Well, I generally believe in the mantra to defund the police. That police is not necessarily the wisest investment, the best investment when it comes to economic mobility. We're clearly not getting our value in terms of tax dollars. If Black people, innocent Black people, are getting killed at higher rates, we're just not getting the same value. So we should be redirecting a lot of that money to services that can actually give us value. So I like the idea of redirecting monies towards social workers and other types of services that will actually amplify the economic mobility in a neighborhood. But again, when you invest in police, you're literally stopping, arresting. When you fund police, you're literally arresting economic mobility, and so we need to invest in things that's going to accelerate economic growth, not suppress it.
And I believe these steps, especially in the Republican majority legislature, are going to take very significant steps towards reimagining law enforcement and how we start moving in that direction that Andre touched on, where we are starting to push resources and funding in areas that allow us to not only protect the community and serve the community, but also have those resources available to ensure that we have the most quality and strong and police officers that we can possibly can. And then they're trained well. And I think what we also don't think about, my uncle, he retired from the St. Louis City Police Department after 27 years. He went his entire career without having to pull a firearm, let alone shoot an unarmed person of any color or race. And so we know that you can do this and you can do your job in an effective manner without having to shoot unarmed people. But we also need to make sure that those police officers are utilizing these services that we are providing for the community to ensure that they're handling their mental health, to ensure that they're taking every step that they need to ensure that they are as qualified continuously throughout their career to be able to effectively police our community.
And I will say this, that I lived in both low income neighborhoods and high income neighborhoods. When you live in a upper income neighborhood, you don't see police. They're not roaming the streets. Which shows you don't need them. I mean, there is an emphasis on policing in low income Black neighborhoods. And I just want to point that out, because the folks who are saying that sounds crazy to fund the police, have you lived in an upper middle class, upper class neighborhood? You never see them. Except for to rescue the cat or something like that, or they're called upon for acute situations, but they're not roaming the streets like you see in the inner city.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to also keep in mind that we have to start encouraging people from the community to go into careers in law enforcement. And that doesn't happen until we build the trust. So we have to start by having police reforms in place where we reimagine public safety and we understand exactly how to build that trust to where people of color want to go back into this profession and actually contribute and help build productive citizens in the Black community.
And another thing I need to point out, because I'm going to keep it on business, because I want to make sure that there's innovations being spurred by into this conversation. There are business opportunities when we're talking about how do we transition from a police dominant society to one that provides other services. There's a business proposition there, and I expect the business leaders of the future to find solutions that don't require investments in police. You know, we could make the business case for diversity pretty easily. Can you imagine the additional innovations if Black people weren't over police that would add to the economy, adding to growth overall? It would be tremendous. And so, you know, everybody benefits from diversity and inclusion, but you know, we need to see solutions that fit in that mode of this is an opportunity to grow for society as a whole.
I had a conversation with several executives and CEOs, and it was a serious issue around tourism here in Missouri, and in St. Louis in particular, is that there's been a decline in businesses wanting to have conferences in Missouri, let alone St. Louis. And a lot of it was stemming to the policies that are coming out of the legislature. So, for example, when Missouri decided to pass a bill that I strongly opposed, which would have eliminated access to an abortion or services at Planned Parenthood, but then also not set an exception for rape and or incest. That had a tremendous economic stronghold on businesses wanting to do business here in the form of conferences, wanting to bring employees here to visit for various reasons. And to think if a policy as draconian as that, and we can't look at the fact that Black people are dying every single day at the hands of policing, that we don't need to do something different in how we engage around ensuring that our police departments are well trained and making sure that we are putting in policies where funding is going in directions that's going to ultimately uplift the Black community and not continue to oppress them.
And I want to add on to that, I think this is primarily a racial problem, but it's not solely a racial problem. We see that people who have mental illness are disproportionately also being targeted and the victims of violence. And, you know, a lot of us have concerns about folks who are neurodiverse, who are on the spectrum. You know, we increasingly are welcoming really wonderful students to our campus who are neurodiverse, and we worry about all of this. So this, I think, is one of those classic situations of where if you lift up the people who are the most vulnerable, you lift up everybody, right? It's not a zero-sum game. Okay, I'm going to ask two last questions, and then we're going to wrap up. So this is again for Senator Williams, but Dre, please feel welcome to comment as well. So one of our folks asked the question: how can social development investments improve areas like Wellston and Kinloch, right, that have really been sort of stripped of their economic viability?
So first, for those who are not familiar with St. Louis, that's listening in and participating, Wellston and Kinloch are two communities, I would argue, far more poverty-stricken than Ferguson. These are communities that have been wiped out through expansion of our airport. Kinloch and Wellston at one point in time would have been by far one of the most vibrant Black business districts in the country. And these are communities that all fall within the footprint of my Senate district. I have committed a significant amount of time to figuring out how do we revitalize these communities? How do we work around affordable and quality housing? So Wellston, for example, we're currently in the process, as we know, the Department of Housing and Urban Development is looking to ultimately get out of low income and project housing. So I had a meeting with Secretary Ben Carson, and this was in St. Louis in regards to how do we revitalize some housing units in Wellston that are in, I mean, just poor conditions, mold everywhere. It's almost scary to think that they expect people to live there. And when I took a tour of these facilities, I truly believe that everyone should have access to affordable and quality housing. And if I don't want anyone, I love to live there. I don't think anyone should live there. So we're in the process of getting these buildings cleaned up, but we want to use these buildings as an anchor to serve as a community-driven impact to ultimately bring resources back to Wellston. Wellston sits just 2 miles north of Washington University, just 2 miles east of Clayton, Missouri, which is one of the wealthiest communities in the entire state of Missouri. There's no reason why, and it's in between 2 public transportation Metrolink lines. There's no reason why we should not have access to a community healthcare facility. There's no reason why Wellston should not have a training facility for folks to be able to go and get training opportunities to go into the workforce and make a quality and livable wage. There's no reason why there should not be education opportunities for the young people that are living in these buildings. And last but not least, we should be providing quality housing for those seniors that are living there and make sure that it remains affordable for them to stay in that community and not ultimately push a population of people out and replace them with a population of people who does not fit that demographic. Kinloch, same thing. If I was to take you, Dre, through Kinloch, you were down in New Orleans and you say it's going to be the 15-year anniversary, or is today the 15-year anniversary for Katrina?
Friday.
So Friday, not only will we recognize the turmoil in New Orleans with Katrina, but we'd also will continue to recognize Kinloch, which is the oldest Black community in St. Louis in Missouri, that looks nothing short of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So those are 2 communities we have to revitalize. They start with investment. What's also unique is St. Louis is a very unique place when you think about the governmental setup. I have 35 municipalities. They all have their own police department. They all have their own government. And we all have to coexist. And that's before you talk about the larger, broader county government that they all sit within. So we're trying to figure out how to coexist and provide services without them overlapping, but also work towards having sufficient policies that are going to work towards housing, education, and ultimately creating an equitable environment. And it's been very challenging. St. Louis is also separated by a boulevard from its city and St. Louis County. So if I was to go on the other side of Skeeter Boulevard, I would be in St. Louis City. If I was to go on the west side of it, I would be in St. Louis County. They're 2 different entities. One has a county executive, Dre, as you remember from your hometown, and the other one has a mayor. So it's a lot of governmental, convoluted government structures that we have to figure out how to work through, because St. Louis City owns land in Kinloch, but even though it's not in the city of St. Louis. And once we work through that to ensure that there are accountabilities and measures put in place with government to take responsibility for who owns what, I'm hoping we can get Kinloch cleaned up as well.
Okay, let me ask one final kind of rapid round question here. A number of folks have asked us different versions of the question of what can I as an ordinary person do? You know, are there organizations out there that you think are effective? You know, in my workplace, are there things that I can be doing to advocate? Are there ways that I can, as a voter, help to press, you know, good local or federal legislation through, right? You kind of got people, what should they do?
Well, I say this is the time to join an organization that's squarely focused on racial justice. You know, it can be one of the historic organizations, the NAACP, the Urban League, or it can be a new organization. It could be a local affiliate of a movement for Black Lives. It can be one of the other budding organizations. But I also say, don't step too far out of your lane. You don't have to. As a student, there's lots of student groups you can join that will help this cause. And I think we need to have professors and researchers at WashU create assignments that really get into this issue. And so you don't have to do anything remarkable. In many ways, being remarkable is about joining a remarkable movement. And that's what we're in. And so I would say focus on your schoolwork, become an expert in your field, and use that expertise to advance racial justice.
I will put in a little bit, just a little plug for something I'm really excited about that I hope my students will be excited about too. Our chancellor committed a plan for racial justice for the university that he's rolling out over the next couple of years. And one of the cornerstones of that plan is that we're hiring over the next 2 to 3 years, 12 faculty members who work solely in the area of race. That's what we're going to do. And his goal is to hire the very best people in the country. We already have a deep research bench that does this. And he said his idea of a moonshot is, what if we bring the very best faculty in the world who work on race to all be at Washington University? So I'm excited about that. And then they can give the students the assignments that you're talking about, Dre.
Exactly.
Senator, what are your thoughts about what folks can do?
Well, one, I'll start with James Baldwin. So he summed it up nicely. He said, know from whence you came. If you know whence you came, there's absolutely no limitation where you can go. I think James Baldwin was very special to me because he was honest and openly acknowledged the past, and was the only way to get towards the future was by moving forward. So that's first what we need to do. But also, I've had an opportunity throughout the summer to participate in marches and rallies all across the state. I went and joined colleagues in rural Missouri, clearly right here in St. Louis, where I live and represent. And I've noticed that there's a movement underway, and it's being driven largely by young people who know that our nation can be a better and safer place for everyone. So now it's time to turn that energy into action. And I think by turning that energy into action at the ballot box, it would only move us in the right direction. And I encourage folks to tell their parents, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, if you're an adult, your boss, everyone to first and foremost vote. I'm not on the ballot this year, so it isn't about me. It's about the future that we want for our families and our communities. So
okay, Brian, I got a real quick late breaking one for you. If you can give us a thumbs up or thumbs down. Okay. Kurt says, I'm sure we're out of town, but I'm interested based on what you just said in whether you believe that consolidating the city and the county would benefit Black residents or not. Up or down? Details, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the devils are in the details, but I will tell you this. St. Louis County spends almost $1 billion annually in services, and that's due to overlapping services through municipalities. So we do need to figure out some form of consolidation, but I don't know 100% what that looks like. It would have to be in front of me, but I will tell you this. If it's not including and improving public education, if it's not including and improving services for underserved and disenfranchised communities, and if it's not centered around quality leadership that's going to take a macro and regional perspective on how they govern and a micro perspective on the details that have held our state and our country back for 400 years, then I will not be in support of it. But if it does that, then I think we can figure something out.
Okay. I want to thank all of our participants today for joining us tonight for a highly engaged chat. Keeping up was a thing. And I especially want to thank Andre Perry and Senator Brian Williams. Really thank you both. You know, as we know, and as you've reminded us, racism is, it's material and it is debilitating, but you've both given us a vision of it in which it is not inevitable and it is not intractable. So thank you both for inspiring all of us and giving us some hope and some concrete things we can do. I want to turn this back over to Dean Mark Taylor.
Well, thank you, Senator Williams, and thank you, Andre Perry, for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us today. I think it's been a sobering, but a very, for me, very instructive, very interesting discussion. And Adrienne Davis, thank you for being our host and enriching the conversation. And I hope that each attendee gained additional insight and understanding that carries over into your everyday lives. Lastly, as a thank you for joining us today, Andre Perry and the Brookings Institution Publishing are offering a special promotion code where you can receive a 30% discount on the purchase of Andre's fantastic book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. And we'll let you know what that promotion code is. So again, thanks again for joining us. Good night and be safe.